You know, Christmas, we're still decorated, I can still talk about Christmas. Christmas may be the most wonderful time of the year. And if you don't believe me, ask Andy Williams. For those of you that didn't get the reference,
wonderful time of the year.
See, you got it. But something happens at Christmas. There's some kind of change, some kind of shift in ourselves, in our culture, in our life that kind of happens. There's like a special feeling in the air. People tend, it's not always true, but tend to be friendlier. Families often get together, even in the midst of a pandemic where we're finding ways to get together. It's almost as if something restorative is happening. As if the grime of the previous year is washing away. And so it's appropriately connected to the new year. I mean, it works well because it's in the close proximity to New Year's. It's only a week difference. But also because I think that Christmas is the beginning of the church calendar. So it's at Advent that the church calendar turns over for the new year. And so Christmas, I think, intentionally brings feelings of newness. That the negative things of last year won't follow us into the new year. Don't we all, Johnny? That there's hope for the future and good things are coming. You sense that? You feel that? That's the kind of the hope, part of the hope of Christmas. That's intentional. What's created at Christmas is intentionally creating that something good is coming. Why is that? What is it about Christmas that gives us that feeling? Is it just its location at the end of the year? Or is it something more? I think it's because at its core, Christmas is about rewiring and creating new contexts. Context, as they say, is everything. It is impossible to understand anything without context. Just listen to my kids run around my house and you'll understand the importance of context. My kids have become fascinated with a joke, but a joke I've told them recently, and they love jokes because they don't understand how they work. And so Evie is constantly trying to tell me jokes. And it's funny because she'll tell me the joke, give me the supposed punchline, and before there's even a pause, she'll be like, "Is that a joke?" Nope. So they become fascinated with this joke I tell them, and she says, so they just start running around the house yelling, "Sick 'em, Jesus!" I figured Scott would know the joke. But without context, that sounds really odd to have a 3-year-old go, "Sick 'em, Jesus!" But the context matters. In fact, the joke itself is about lost context. There's a thief, and he's breaking into a house. And as he's climbing through the window, he hears a voice go, "Jesus is watching you." The thief kind of pauses for a minute. He's looking around. He doesn't see anybody. Maybe that's just my conscience talking. So he goes in, he starts looking for stuff, something valuable, and he hears again, "Jesus is watching you." Shining the flashlight around, looking around, doesn't see anything. He's really confused, and he starts tiptoeing around the corner, and he hears it again, "Jesus is watching you." And he quickly turns his flashlight, and there in the corner is a bird cage, and in the bird cage is a parrot. And he walks up to the parrot, and the parrot says, Jesus is watching you. And the guy just, wow, laughs and says, oh, that was close. And kind of drops the flashlight. And he drops the flashlight, he notices that there's a big Rottweiler under the bird cage. And the parrot says, sick him, Jesus. My kids love that joke. But it's lost context. Just hearing Jesus is watching you put it in a context that was not the right one. The thief heard it in a context that was different than the one he was actually in. So we can easily twist meaning by taking things and removing them from their context. That's why I'm always suspicious when I watch movie trailers of the praise from critics on the movie trailer. So the critic may have said, this is a fantastic movie if you don't like plot or character development. But what ends up in the trailer is, fantastic movie! Context is how we discern meaning in every situation. My go-to to try how important context is if I say, what does this mean? Well, if it's the 40s, what does it mean? Victory. If it's the 60s, if I'm at a bar and I'm raving at the bartender, not that you know that, not that I know that. I don't know why that was the reference that popped in my head. The thing is, this just has no meaning without context. If I turn it to the side, I'm playing rock, paper, scissors, right? It has no meaning unless there's context around it to give it meaning. And the same is actually true about God. Context is what reveals who God is. It's how we understand Him. It's how we understand what He's doing in and through us. When we talk about God works in reality, that's speaking directly to context. God doesn't work in a vacuum. God doesn't reveal Himself in a vacuum. God works and reveals and does things in context and in response to a context. I'm constantly amazed when I hear about the context in which Jesus was doing things, especially when it's so vastly different than our own. So oftentimes what happens is the gospel writers are writing about what Jesus is saying and doing, and there's a context there that they are so familiar with that they just assume the readers know. And the problem is that 2,000 years ago, that may have been true. Today, that is not at all true. And so my dad was just telling me this a couple of days ago about reading the context in which it had to deal with one of the festivals, and there's part of the practice had something to do with water and pouring water on stuff or washing something. I had to do something with water. And my dad said that it was out of that, it was at that festival, at that ritual, at that practice, where Jesus said, I am the living water. Like Jesus, we get sometimes the way the gospel writers wrote the Gospels, we kind of get Jesus in a vacuum sometimes. Like we don't know exactly what time of year it was. We don't recognize the clues that tell us what Jesus was doing or what the disciples were engaged in or what the culture was aware of at the time. And so Jesus is just like, I'm the living water. And we're like, yeah, that sounds good. And then I just love being able to put that in the context in which Jesus was speaking. Jeremiah, in his prophecy about the Messiah in chapter 23, shares with us a new context for God's people. And I think tells us why new contexts matter. Jeremiah starts out and he says, therefore the days are surely coming when you'll no longer swear an oath by saying, as surely as the Lord lives, who brought you up out of Egypt. Paraphrase. That was the guy you gave an oath. Surely as the Lord lives, who brought us up out of the land of Egypt. That's because that's their context if they need to understand their relationship with God, it's attached to the context of bringing them out of slavery, out of Egypt. Israel's whole identity and orientation to the world was derived from God bringing them up out of Egypt. They are the people God freed from Egypt. They're His precisely because He brought them up out of Egypt. They are God's people because of that. For generations, this guided them as a people. Why they should obey the law, because God brought us up out of Egypt. Why they should remain faithful to Yahweh, because He faithfully brought them up out of Egypt. How should they live in the world as a people who follow the Lord, because He brought us up out of Egypt. And then Jeremiah changes the context and says, no longer will we say, as surely as the Lord lives who brought you up out of Egypt. Instead, you'll say, as surely as the Lord lives who brought us out of the lands of the north and back to our homeland and brought us out of exile. This is the new context for Israel. God is still the God who brought them out of Egypt, but that happened a really long time ago. No one is still alive who witnessed it, who benefited from it, who experienced it. It's an old context. Now, God is the one who will bring them out of exile. They can all identify with that. That gives them something new to connect to, something they have experienced, a personal connection that they have to this God that brought them out. So what does this mean for God? And I almost just lost my place. What does this mean for God? And what does it say about God, about His relationship to His people, about His people's relationship to Him? I think the most profound thing it says is that God continues His relationship with His people. God continues His relationships. You see, relationships are not destinations, but journeys. They must be traveled. No relationship was ever just arrived at. You may have people you connected to kind of built that relationship real quick, but no relationship is just arrived at. Relationships begin and continue where they die. A relationship that does not continue with new experiences grows old and stale. People become somebody we used to know. No new stories are ever made or told. Eventually, that relationship fades away, like friends you haven't talked to in years or decades. Still remember them fondly, but the connection is less. In some cases, it may be gone. Your context has changed without them. There's often talk among people that spend a lot of time overseas. You see this with missionaries a lot, and they come back and there's like a culture shock. And it's not just with missionaries that leave the country. You also see it in people that move away and are gone for a lot of years and then come back home. Or even, you can even see it in like youth when they go to a youth camp or go to a youth convention and then come back. It's, I've left and my context has been completely changed and I've been changed, and then I go back to an old context and nobody else changed with me. It used to happen to me every year. I'd go home for the summer after college. I'd have this college year that to me was just, didn't feel that transformative, but it's hard to go through a year in college and not be transformed some way. And so I'd come back and I would realize how transformative that year had been. And so I had to get reacclimated to my old context because it felt like it was like I had changed and no one else had. Or at least not, they hadn't changed. They had changed, but they hadn't changed with me. And I was in a place that was drastically amping up how fast my transformation was happening. But that's normal. Healthy living relationships constantly require new experiences. New experiences create new opportunities for growth. They create new moments that strengthen our bond. Like if Marie and I never had any new experiences in our relationship after we got married, I'm not sure we'd still be married. I'm pretty confident we wouldn't be. Marie and I are constantly talking to each other about how different we are than the kids that got married 15 years ago. And then how much we enjoy that we're on that journey together and that we've traveled it together, and how horrified we'd be if one of us took the journey and the other didn't. The fact that God morphs from being the God who brought them out of Egypt to the God who brings them out of exile shows him to be someone who continues his relationships. The relationship didn't end after deliverance. It didn't grow old and stale. New contexts were created, new experiences to reveal more of God. It shows that he is concerned about his people. He still hasn't given up on them, and he is still present and aware of their situation. When we celebrate Christmas and New Year's, we are celebrating a new context to experience God. Christmas is a remembrance of a contextual change of how we understand God, right? The birth of Jesus marks the introduction of a new context. No longer will they say, "This is the God who brought us up out of Egypt," and no longer shall we say, "This is the God who brought us up out of exile." Now we'll say, "This is the God who became human and dwelt among us." This is where God actually became human, dwelt with us, walked the earth, experienced what humanity was like. He has taken on our experiences and knows what it's like to be human, and has worked from within creation, not just over it. We celebrate that during Christmas. That's what we're celebrating. That's what we're talking about. When we sing all these songs and we decorate, what we're trying to do is celebrate that new context. But in addition to that, we're not just remembering that Christ came 2,000 years ago, but we're anticipating the coming of his final inauguration of the kingdom. So we're celebrating the anticipation of a new context, that God will no longer be the God who brought us up out of Egypt. He'll no longer be the God who brought us out of exile, and he'll no longer be the God that came to us as human, but he'll be the God who came as king of his kingdom. And a whole new context will change. The kingdom of God begins to appear with Christ as the king. And this is where Jeremiah talks about the righteous branch of David, who reigns wisely, who executes justice and righteousness, and who saves his people. This new kingdom will bring new life to us because there's no oppression or war, because the king rules with justice. There is no poverty or death because the king cares for his people. And even as we talk about the context of Jesus coming in the past and Jesus coming in the future, there's a context that we live in right now, and we celebrate of a God who comes to us today. Even now, God sends his Spirit to indwell in our hearts, to work in our lives, that we might become something more than just the dust of the earth. Children of God. Created with love, created for a purpose, created to share God's love with others. So it's why we sing at Christmas time. His name is called Emmanuel, God with us, revealed in us. And we sing, O come, Emmanuel, and ransom captive Israel that mourns in and lonely exile here until the Son of God appear. Perhaps this Christmas and this new year, you need the Son of God to appear, to ransom your captive heart from the exile of addiction, grief, anger, despair, from a context that is killing you instead of bringing life. Christ brings a new context, a new way of living in the world that offers hope, promises life, and brings peace. I am excited about 2021, not just because I'm hoping that all the terrible things of 2020 will get left in 2020, because let's be honest, a pandemic doesn't know what month it is. But I'm excited because I'm looking forward to seeing what God wants to do to create new contexts for us. What new context He has for me, for my family, for us, for the church, for our world. I was writing some thank you cards yesterday. I made a joke about, should we thank this person for all the work that they've been doing to help make a better me, make a new me? And Maria laughed and she said, well, I don't know if you're a new you just yet. But I know that over the last year, I've been on a journey to a new me. And maybe a new isn't the right word, but it works for the season. But a more authentic, a more genuine, a more me. I think that's a journey we're all on. I think that's at least the journey maybe we all should be on. Maybe we should join Soren Kierkegaard and saying and praying, with God's help, I am becoming myself. So here's what we're going to do, is we're going to do an old practice in a new context. We've got the elements out to take communion. And we're going to let this be a chance for us to remember that Christ came and that He died to give us a new context, a new relationship with God. And that we take this because it didn't just happen 2,000 years ago, but that when we take the bread and when we take the cup, we get to enjoy and experience that context all over again, fresh and new. That's why we have our rituals and our traditions. It's not just so that we can check them off a task sheet. It's so that we can enter into a context which we may have forgotten, which we may have lost connection to, and to reconnect to it and experience it fresh. Now I need to come down and get mine because I forgot. I was going to bring it up and I forgot. It happens. You ever forget? It happens to me. So in the original context, the people were getting ready to leave Egypt. And they had a meal, and they gathered together, and they said they'd put the lamb's blood on the doorposts. The spirit of death would pass over them. And they stayed indoors, and they had a meal, and they celebrated the passing over of the spirit of death and the freeing of them from bondage in Egypt. And they continued that practice for thousands of years. And then Jesus, God's new context, took that practice and made it fresh and new for His disciples. And he took the bread that was to remind them of how fast and much they had to travel because they couldn't let the bread rise, so it had to be unleavened. And he said, "This is my body. It's broken for you." And then he took the cup, a cup that celebrated the sweetness of who God was. And he said, "This is my blood, the blood of the new covenant, a new context, the growing relationship between God and his people, no longer dependent on sacrifice, but now dependent on God's grace and mercy." And he passed it to his disciples. And they took, and they ate it, they drank the cup, and they experienced a new context. So now I invite you to take our bread and eat. And to take the cup and drink. Every time we do this, during this year, may it remind us that God is continually inviting us into new contexts and new places to reveal himself to us. Thank you for being part of our online family. Don't forget to subscribe and click the bell so you get notifications for any future videos or content. And feel free to please share with a friend. You can also follow us on Facebook or Instagram, and if you feel so inclined and would like to donate and support our ministry, please click the donate button found in the description. Thank you, and God bless you.